February 12, 1969. 40 meters from an NVA command post, 5 Australian soldiers lie frozen in the undergrowth. They can hear every word. Officers arguing over maps, radio static, the click of rifle bolts, one wrong breath, one snapped twig, and they're dead. But before we go further, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of Vietnam, the covert operations, the psychological warfare, and the warriors who operated in the shadows, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Vietnam War records. We bring you the missions they never talked about, the tactics that changed warfare, and the truth behind the legends. Now, let's step into the jungle, where silence meant survival and the Australians became the enemy's worst nightmare. The Vietnam War was loud. Helicopter blades chopping through humid artillery shells screaming across ridgelines. M60 machine gun. American doctrine was built on firepower, mobility, and overwhelming force. When contact was made, the solution was simple. Call in airstrikes, bring the artillery, saturate the area with steel and explosives. It worked, sometimes. But in the dense triple canopy jungle of Phuoc Thu province, in the shadow valleys along the Cambodian border, where the enemy knew every trail, every stream, every hiding place, carved into the earth over decades of war, noise was a death sentence. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army didn't fight the way Americans expected. They vanished. They watched. They waited. And when the moment came, they struck from positions you never saw, then melted back into the jungle before the first helicopter could respond. The Americans struggled with this, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because their doctrine wasn't designed for it. U.S. reconnaissance teams, including the legendary MACV-SOG units operating across the border, were some of the most elite soldiers on the planet. They conducted missions deep into Laos and Cambodia, walked into the lion's den, and came back with intelligence that shaped the war. But their approach was different. SOG teams often numbered 8 to 12 men. They carried heavy radios, extra ammunition, M16s, grenade launchers, claymore mines. They had firepower because they expected contact. When they were compromised, and they often were, the plan was to fight their way to an extraction zone while helicopter gunships and fast movers provided cover. It was aggressive, kinetic, and incredibly dangerous. The casualty rates reflected that reality. Every SOG operator who served multiple tours was wounded at least once. Many didn't come home. Then there were the Australians. When the Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in 1966, they brought with them a completely different philosophy. It wasn't born in Vietnam. It was refined over years of brutal counterinsurgency warfare during the Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1960, where British and Australian forces fought communist insurgents in jungle conditions that made Vietnam look easy. The lesson learned in Malaya was simple. You can't out-guerrilla the guerrilla by being louder. You have to be quieter, slower, more patient, invisible. The Australian SAS didn't come to Vietnam to fight. They came to watch, to listen, to gather intelligence so precise that when the hammer finally fell, it landed exactly where it needed to. Their mission wasn't to engage the enemy. It was to become ghosts. An Australian SAS patrol in Vietnam typically consisted of 4 to 5 men. That's it. No heavy weapons teams, no radio relay specialists, just 4 highly trained soldiers carrying 40 pounds of equipment, moving through enemy-controlled territory at a pace that would frustrate any American commander used to rapid maneuver warfare. 100 meters per hour, sometimes less. Every step deliberate. Every movement calculated. They didn't break branches. They didn't disturb the undergrowth in a way that would be visible an hour later. They stepped on rocks, on roots, on the hardest ground they could find. When they had to cross soft earth, they walked backward, creating confusion for any tracker trying to follow. When they stopped, they froze completely. For minutes, sometimes hours, listening, watching, waiting for the jungle to forget they were there. Their loads were stripped down to the essentials. 1 week's worth of rations, and those rations were carefully selected. No processed foods, no canned meals that smelled like industrial preservatives. The Australians had learned that the human body emits odors based on diet, and in the jungle, where the air is thick and still, an enemy tracker can smell you before he sees you. American soldiers raised on a diet heavy in red meat, dairy, and processed sugars had a scent profile that Viet Cong trackers, many of them indigenous Montagnard tribesmen, with senses honed over lifetimes in the jungle, could detect from dozens of meters away. The Australians adapted. They ate lighter. They reduced their scent signature. They applied local vegetation to their uniforms and skin, not just for visual camouflage, but to mask their human smell with the organic decay of the jungle floor. Communication was minimal. American reconnaissance teams maintained regular radio contact with their command posts. Every few hours, a situation report, position updates, intelligence summaries. It kept commanders informed, but it also radio transmissions could be intercepted, direction-finding equipment could triangulate your position, and even if the enemy couldn't decode your message, they knew you were there. Australian SAS patrols operated under radio silence for days. 72 hours was not uncommon. They carried radios for emergencies, for calling in artillery if they were compromised. But during the reconnaissance phase, silence was absolute. They communicated with hand signals developed over years of training. A clenched fist meant freeze. A flat hand moving downward meant get down. Two fingers pointed at the eyes, then toward a direction, meant enemy spotted. No words, no whispers, nothing. They moved at night when possible, but they didn't march through the darkness. They moved in short bursts. 50 meters. Stop. Listen for 30 minutes. 50 more meters. Stop. Listen again. The jungle at night is alive with sound. Insects, birds, animals moving through the canopy. The rustle of leaves in the wind, but underneath that natural symphony, the metallic click of a rifle sling against a buckle, the soft crush of a boot on dry leaves, the low murmur of voices. The Australians trained themselves to filter out the jungle noise and focus on the human noise. And when they heard it, they stopped. They became part of the terrain, motionless, invisible. In early 1966, during Operation Crimp, one of the first major joint Australian-American operations of the war, an Australian SAS patrol was tasked with reconnaissance ahead of a large-scale assault by the U.S. Immediate 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 1st Infantry Division. The target was the Coochie Tunnel Complex, a massive underground network of tunnels, bunkers, and supply caches northwest of Saigon that served as a Viet Cong headquarters. American intelligence suspected it was there, but they didn't know the layout, the entry points, or how many enemy soldiers were inside. That's where the SAS came in. A 5-man patrol was inserted on foot, walking in from a secured area rather than flying in by helicopter. Helicopter insertions were fast, but they announced your presence to everyone within kilometers. The sound of rotor blades echoing through the jungle was an invitation for the enemy to start watching, waiting, preparing. The SAS patrol moved slowly. It took them 2 days to cover 12. They crossed streams by wading through the water to avoid leaving tracks. They avoided trails entirely, moving through the thickest, most miserable terrain they could find, because that's where the enemy wouldn't expect anyone to go. On the 3rd day, they found it. Fresh tracks, multiple sets, leading toward a dense tree line. They followed at a distance, carefully, until they saw movement, dozens of them, moving in and out of the jungle like they owned it, because they did. The patrol halted. They didn't engage. They didn't call in an airstrike. They watched. They established an observation post 30 meters from one of the tunnel entrances, concealed in the undergrowth, and they sat there for 48 hours. 48 hours. Try to imagine that. Lying on your stomach in the mud. Insects crawling over your skin. The heat pressing down like a wet blanket. Unable to move. Unable to speak. Unable to even shift your weight without risking detection. Watching enemy soldiers walk past you. Close enough to hear their conversations. Close enough to see the dirt under their fingernails. The SAS operators counted heads, estimated weapons, noted patterns. They sketched the layout of the tunnel entrances in small waterproof notebooks. They photographed key positions using silent cameras, and when they had everything they needed, they waited for nightfall, then, slowly, methodically, crawled backward out of their position. It took them 6 hours to move 200 meters, then they walked out. No extraction helicopter, no dramatic firefight. They just disappeared into the jungle, linked up with friendly forces, and delivered their intelligence. Days later, when the 173rd Airborne and the Big Red One stormed the Coochie complex, they knew exactly where to go. The operation uncovered one of the largest tunnel networks of the entire war, and the SAS patrol that made it possible never fired a shot. That became the signature of Australian operations in Vietnam. Patience, discipline, the willingness to sit in the danger zone longer than anyone else would dare. American commanders noticed. In 1968, a joint training program was established at Nui Dat, the Australian base in Phu Qa province. US Special Forces soldiers, including veterans from MACV-SOG, came to learn from the Australians. The training was humbling. American soldiers, accustomed to moving quickly and relying on superior firepower, found themselves struggling to keep up with the Australian pace, or rather, the lack of pace. One exercise involved moving through a designated area, while Australian instructors, playing the role of enemy trackers, tried to follow. The Americans were detected within hours. The Australians then demonstrated the same movement, and the trackers found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed soil, no scent trail. It was as if no one had been there at all. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army quickly learned to distinguish between American and Australian patrols. Captured enemy documents, now declassified and stored in the Australian War Memorial Archives, reveal a fascinating and grudging respect. One intelligence report from a D445 battalion officer in 1968 warned his subordinates that Australian reconnaissance teams operate differently from American units. They move slowly, leave minimal trace, and appear to know our patrol routes. The report recommended increased vigilance and doubled sentries when Australian presence was suspected. Another captured document, this one from an NVA political officer, described the Australians as the silent ones, and noted that tracking them was extremely difficult compared to American units. Post-war interviews with Vietnamese veterans confirmed this. Nguyen Van Tien, a former North Vietnamese army officer who fought in Phu Tuy province, was interviewed by Australian historians in 1995. His words were striking. "We feared the Australians in the bush," he said. "The Americans you could hear coming. They brought helicopters, artillery, noise. We knew how to deal with that. Disperse. Hide. Wait for them to leave. The Australians, you never heard them. They would watch you for days. You wouldn't know they were there until it was too late. It was psychological warfare. You always felt like you were being watched. That psychological impact was intentional. The Australian SAS understood that in guerrilla warfare, perception is a weapon. If the enemy believes you are everywhere, if they can't sleep soundly in their own base camps, if they constantly look over their shoulders, their effectiveness degrades, morale suffers, mistakes happen, and mistakes in the jungle are fatal. The Australians didn't need to kill thousands of enemy soldiers to have an impact. They needed to make the enemy feel hunted in their own territory. And they did. In April 1967, during Operation Hayman, a four-man SAS patrol led by Sergeant we'll call Jack McLeod, a pseudonym used for operational security even decades later, was tasked with locating NVA supply routes in War Zone D, a notorious enemy stronghold. The patrol inserted on foot from Nui Dat and spent 3 days moving 12 kilometers into enemy-controlled territory. They found more than supply routes. On the 4th day, they discovered an active NVA base camp. Not a temporary shelter, a full base. Bunkers, weapon caches, supply dumps, and soldiers. At least 80 of them. The patrol could have called in artillery immediately. They could have radioed, but that would have scattered the enemy and destroyed the intelligence value. Instead, 25 meters. That's how close they got. Close enough to hear officers giving orders, close enough to photograph the layout of the camp. One member of the patrol was a Vietnamese linguist, a skill the Australians prioritized because understanding the enemy's language meant understanding their intentions. The linguist listened as NVA officers discussed movement plans for the following week. Exact routes, exact times. The kind of intelligence that couldn't be extracted any other way. The patrol remained in position for 30 hours. They photographed everything: weapon caches, radio equipment, map boards visible through open tent flaps. They counted soldiers during meal formations. They noted sentry rotation, and when they had everything, they crawled out slowly, methodically. Once they reached a safe distance, they called in an artillery strike. The camp was destroyed. 15 supply caches were obliterated based on the coordinates they provided. The intelligence led directly to Operation Paddington, a major Australian offensive that disrupted NVA operations in the region for months. But the operation that truly defined the Australian SAS capability happened in February 1969, Operation Matilda. The mission was classified for decades, and even now many details remain redacted. A 5-man patrol was inserted into the jungle near the Cambodian border. Cambodia was officially neutral, but everyone knew the NVA used it as a sanctuary. They built base camps, stored supplies, and planned operations on the Cambodian side of the border. then crossed into South Vietnam to attack, knowing that Allied forces were restricted from pursuing them. The rules of engagement were clear. Don't cross the border. But intelligence gathering was a grey area. The SAS patrol's mission was to confirm the location of NAVA sanctuaries. They crossed the border, quietly, unofficially, deniably. They moved for 5 days, deeper into Cambodia than any official record would acknowledge. They were beyond artillery range, beyond helicopter support. If they were compromised, they were on their own. On the 6th day, they found what they were looking for. Multiple NVA base camps within a 5-kilometer radius, not temporary camps, permanent installations, buildings with metal roofs, radio antennas, motor pools. This was a rear area headquarters, a place where the NAVA felt safe. The patrol picked the largest camp and moved toward it, 40 meters from the command post. They could see officers moving inside the tents. They could see radio operators hunt. They could see map boards covered with tactical overlays, and they photographed it all. At one point, an enemy sentry walked within 3 meters of their concealed position. 3 meters. The SAS operators didn't move, didn't breathe. The sentry paused. He looked around. He was sensing something, the way a deer senses a predator, even when it can't see it. The jungle was too quiet, but he didn't see anything. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on. The patrol remained frozen for another 15 minutes, waiting for the adrenaline to subside, waiting for their heart rates to drop, waiting for the jungle to resume its normal rhythm. Then they continued observing. They photographed NVA operational maps visible through an open tent flap. Maps that showed planned infiltration routes into South Vietnam, maps that would later be used to plan B-52 strikes. When they finally extracted, walking out the same way they came in, the intelligence they brought back was classified at the highest levels. The missions that followed, the airstrikes that destroyed those sanctuaries, were never officially attributed to ground reconnaissance. But the SAS operators knew, and the enemy knew. The difference between the Australian approach and the American approach wasn't about bravery. Both forces produced some of the most courageous soldiers in history. It was about the Americans were trained to dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and mobility. When they made contact, they brought everything they had to bear on the enemy. The Australians were trained to avoid contact entirely, unless it served a specific purpose. Their goal was to be invisible, to gather intelligence, and to leave the fighting to the larger conventional forces who could leverage that intelligence. It was a different kind of warfare, slower, more patient, more psychological. And in the jungles of Vietnam, it was devastatingly effective. The statistics tell the story. Over 5 years, Australian SAS patrols conducted more than 1,200 missions, including over 800 reconnaissance operations. They filed more than 10,000 intelligence reports. They confirmed over 500 enemy kills and captured 30 prisoners for interrogation. And they did it with a detection rate of only 15 to 20%, compared to the 60% average for American reconnaissance teams. Only 2 SAS soldiers were killed in action during the entire Vietnam deployment, not because the enemy wasn't dangerous, not because the missions, but because the Australians had perfected the art of not being seen. American Special Forces operators recognized this. Colonel Robert Howard, a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the most decorated soldiers in U.S. history, spent multiple tours with MACV-SOG conducting cross-border reconnaissance missions. He later said, "The Australians were ghosts. We learned a lot from them about patience and silence. They could sit in one spot for days without moving. That kind of discipline saves lives." The U.S. Army began adopting smaller reconnaissance team sizes in 1969 and 1970. Influenced directly by Australian tactics, emphasis shifted from firepower to stealth, from rapid movement to deliberate observation. The lessons learned in Vietnam would shape special operations doctrine for decades. But the cost of that discipline, that patience, that constant proximity to death, was measured in ways that don't appear in after-action reports. The psychological toll on SAS operators was immense. Imagine spending days lying motionless in enemy territory, knowing that if you're discovered, help isn't coming, knowing that the nearest friendly forces are hours away, maybe days, knowing that every sound, every movement, every breath could be the one that gives you away. The stress was extraordinary. Some men thrived under it, others broke. The SAS had rigorous psychological screening before deployment, and even then, not everyone made it through. Post-mission debriefings were mandatory, not just to extract intelligence, but to give the operators a chance to decompress. to process what they'd seen and heard and felt. The enemy experienced their own psychological trauma. Captured Viet Cong soldiers described the paranoia of operating in areas where the Australians were known to patrol. They doubled their sentries. They slept less. They argued among themselves about whether shadows in the jungle were real or imagined. One captured VC document, translated by Australian intelligence, contained a phrase that became legendary among SAS veterans: "Beware the phantoms who walk without sound." It was meant as a warning to VC cadres. It became an unofficial motto for the Australian SAS. The intelligence gathered by these reconnaissance missions had strategic consequences that rippled far beyond individual firefights. When the Australians confirmed the location of NVA supply caches, those caches were destroyed, which meant enemy units went without ammunition, without food, without medical supplies. When they photographed enemy base camps, those camps were hit with artillery or airstrikes which disrupted enemy planning and forced them to relocate, which took time and resources. When they captured enemy documents or prisoners, the intelligence extracted led to larger operations that disrupted entire enemy networks. The SAS operators didn't win the war by themselves, no, but they provided the intelligence that allowed larger forces to fight smarter, to strike harder, and to save lives on both sides by ending engagements more quickly. One of the most valuable aspects of Australian reconnaissance was the confirmation of enemy order of battle. Knowing which enemy units were in which areas allowed Allied commanders to anticipate enemy actions. If the NAVA 274th Regiment was confirmed in Phuoc Tuy Province, that meant a major operation was likely being planned. If the D445 Battalion was repositioning toward the coast, that meant they were preparing for an attack on Allied supply lines. The Australians provided that information. They watched, they listened, they reported. And the Allied response was informed, precise. The Australians also pioneered counter-tracking tactics that became textbook material for special operations forces worldwide. When they suspected they were being followed, they didn't run. They set up ambushes. The hang and wait technique involved the patrol suddenly halting, moving off the trail, and setting up a hasty ambush position. If enemy trackers were following, they would walk directly into the kill zone. If no one appeared after several hours, the patrol continued. It was a psychological game. The enemy knew the Australians used this tactic, which made them more cautious, which slowed them down, which gave the SAS patrol more time to evade. They also used doglegging, a zigzag movement pattern that made it harder for trackers to predict their direction. They walked through streams to eliminate scent trails. They backtracked over their own trail to confuse trackers about their direction of travel. Every technique was designed to buy time, create doubt, and make the enemy hesitate. The enemy adapted. Viet Cong and NVA units operating in areas where the Australians were active began using their own countermeasures. They increased patrols. They placed booby traps along likely infiltration routes. They trained their own scouts to look for the subtle signs of Australian movement, the slight disturbance of leaves, the faint impression on moss-covered rocks. It became a chess match, each side studying the other, each side refining their tactics. The jungle became a proving ground for reconnaissance techniques that would influence military doctrine for generations. But for all the tactical brilliance, for all the successful missions, there were moments of failure. Moments when patrols were compromised. Moments when the enemy got lucky, or the Australians made a mistake, or the jungle itself betrayed them. In those moments, the discipline held. The training took over. Extraction protocols were executed flawlessly. Emergency rally points were pre-designated. Every man knew exactly what to do if contact was made. They fought their way out when necessary, but even in contact, the goal was disengagement, not destruction. Break contact, evade, link up, extract. Live to gather intelligence another day. The respect between the Australians and their American counterparts was mutual. US units operating alongside the Australians in Phuoc Tuy Province learned quickly that when the SAS reported enemy positions, those reports were accurate. When they called in artillery, the coordinates were precise. When they provided intelligence for a planned operation, that intelligence could be trusted. That trust was earned mission by mission, patrol by patrol. The Americans had their own elite units, their own heroes, their own legendary operations. But they recognized that the Australians had mastered a specific aspect of jungle warfare that nobody else had quite figured out. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends far beyond the war itself. The tactics developed and refined in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province became the foundation for Australian Special Operations Doctrine. When the SAS deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq decades later, they carried those lessons with them: patience, discipline, silent movement, the ability to observe without being observed, the willingness to sit in the danger zone longer than the enemy expects. Those principles didn't change. The terrain changed. The enemy changed. The technology changed, but the fundamental philosophy remained the same. The Vietnamese veterans who fought against the Australians carried their own memories. In interviews conducted years after the war, many expressed a grudging respect. They spoke of nights when they felt watched but saw nothing. They spoke of operations that failed because the enemy, the Allied forces, knew too much, knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. They spoke of friends who vanished on patrol and were never found, ambushed by soldiers they never saw coming. War is horror. It's loss. It's trauma that echoes through generations. But within that horror, there are moments of professional respect between warriors who recognize skill when they encounter it. The Vietnamese recognized the skill of the Australian SAS, but they respected it. For the Australian soldiers who served in those reconnaissance patrols, the war never truly ended. They came home to a country that largely ignored the Vietnam War, a country that didn't celebrate its veterans the way other nations did. There were no parades, no public acknowledgement. Many SAS operators never spoke about their service, not because they were ashamed, but because the operations were classified, because the memories were painful, because the people around them didn't understand and didn't want to. It took decades for Australia to fully recognize the sacrifice and skill of its Vietnam veterans. But within the special operations community, the legacy was never forgotten. The operators who served in Vietnam trained the next generation. They passed down the lessons. They ensured that the tactics, the discipline, the mindset that kept them alive in the missions they conducted, the intelligence they gathered, the enemy they watched from meters away, all of it was documented in classified after-action reports, in intelligence summaries, in debriefing transcripts that sat in archives for decades. When those documents were finally declassified, they revealed the extraordinary scope of what the Australian SAS accomplished. They weren't the largest unit in Vietnam. They weren't the most publicized, but they were, by any measure, one of the most effective. The ratio of intelligence gathered to casualties sustained was unmatched. The impact on enemy morale and operational effectiveness was disproportionate to their numbers. They proved that in guerrilla warfare, the ability to see without being seen is more valuable than the ability to destroy. The jungle doesn't forget. The places where those patrols operated, the trails they walked, the observation posts they occupied, are still there. The jungle has reclaimed them. The bunkers have collapsed. The base camps have rotted away. But the ground remembers, and the men who walked that ground, who lay in the mud for days listening to the enemy breathe, they remember too. They remember the fear, the exhaustion, the moments of pure terror when a sentry walked too. They remember the relief of extraction, the debriefing, the knowledge that the intelligence they gathered would save lives. They remember their brothers, the ones who didn't come home, the ones whose names are etched on memorials in Canberra, in Swanbourne, in the towns they grew up in. The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is a story of discipline over aggression, patience over speed, intelligence over firepower. It's a story of men who volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who walked into the enemy's backyard and sat there watching, who trusted their training and their brothers more than their weapons. It's a story that challenges the popular narrative of the Vietnam War as a conflict fought with helicopters and artillery and B-52 strikes. Those things were real. They were necessary. But underneath the noise, in the silence of the jungle, there were men who fought a different kind of war, a quieter war, a smarter war, and they won their battles not by being louder than the enemy but by being silent, 40 meters from an NVA command post. Listening to officers argue, watching them move, knowing that one mistake means death, and then walking away. Undetected, mission complete. That was the Australian SAS in Vietnam. That was the standard they set. That was the legacy they left. And when US Special Forces officers say they learned from the Australians, when captured enemy documents describe them as phantoms, when Vietnamese veterans decades later still speak of them with a mixture of fear and respect, it's because those men earned it in the jungle, in the silence, in the space between heartbeats, where survival is a choice and discipline is the only weapon that matters. The Vietnam War was fought by millions. It was decided by politics, by strategy, Our force is far beyond any individual soldier's control, but in the jungles of Phuoc Thu province, along the Cambodian border, in Warzone D, small teams of Australian soldiers changed the nature of reconnaissance warfare. They proved that 4 men with discipline could accomplish what 40 men with firepower could not. They proved that patience is a weapon. They proved that the enemy you never see is the enemy you fear most, and they came home, most of them. And they carried those lessons forward, not just for themselves, but for every soldier who would follow. Every special operations team that trains today in reconnaissance, in surveillance, in the art of being invisible, stands on the foundation those Australian SAS patrols built in Vietnam, 40 meters from the enemy. Undetected. That's not just a mission, that's a legacy. If this story moved you, if you want to hear more about the warriors who operated in the shadows, the missions that were never publicized, and the tactics that changed modern warfare, do me a favor. Subscribe to Vietnam War Records. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me what stories you want to hear next. Because these missions, these men, they deserve to be remembered. Not just as statistics, not just as names on a memorial, but as the professionals they were. The ghosts who walked the jungle and came home to tell about it. Thank you for watching. And remember, the greatest weapon in war isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the silence.